No slow lanes, do not lock knowledge in chains, do not take our rights away, to connect, communicate. No slow lanes, do not kill our innovation, do not let money decide our access to information. No slow.
Welcome to Zine Your Research, the podcast series, where we're talking about zines in academia. I am Catherine Hicks, an arts and humanities librarian at Tulane University. Today I'm talking to Bernadette and Ellie Goecken from the Newcomb Archives and Vorhoff collection about zines and feminist pedagogies. So thank you for joining me. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Ellie. I am the archivist for public engagement and research services here at the Newcomb Institute. So any research requests that we get from faculty, staff, students, members of the community, I help out with those. I love working with the zine collection. We work with it a lot with classes, so it's interesting to get to see students experience the zines for the first time.
Beautiful.
And I'm Bernadette. I'm the head of archives here at Newcomb Archives. And I guess my personal research is in feminist reflections of the abject. And that sometimes, or a lot of times, goes into like American pop culture. And, so through that, I think that DIY feminism and zines really are kind of distinct in pop culture, especially Riot Grrrl movement. And the 90s. So yeah.
For sure. Can y'all tell me a little bit more about what your collections are like, why there's a zine collection here?
Yeah, so the Newcomb Archives is a very unique collection. We focus on feminism, gender and sexuality, and gender equity in the Gulf South. So we have a lot of different collections relating to that. We've got our tarot collection, which is pretty unique to most archival collections, as well as our zine collection, which is what we're here to talk about. But yeah, it's been a really fun opportunity getting to explore this collection. I've only been here for a couple months, but it's been a really great time.
So at Newcomb Archives, like the zines fall under a category that we call DIY feminism. And so it's kind of a political outlook through which feminist archivists, scholars communicate and elevate ideas via independent cultural production that resists mainstream representations. So DIY feminist material culture encompasses many formats, including zines, but also, that's where our tarot decks fit in, our artist books, byproducts of like creative activism, so like posters, banners, swags, buttons, stickers, that kind of thing. We all kind of put into DIY feminism, and we use that particular part of our collection as a way to teach a more creative research strategy.
And we implement that with our instructionals and events. A lot of times when we have workshops with our zine collection, we'll give students time to create their own little mini zines or just like a little postcard. We've had folks create their own tarot cards before with the goal to kind of create a Tulane and Newcomb tarot deck eventually at some point. But we really like to incorporate that creativity into teaching others.
Yeah. So are the zines in your collection, are they typically about feminist issues? Are they from particular time periods? Are they by particular groups of people? Or is it more a broad cross-section of feminist scholars?
So we have two distinct, labeled zine collections or, that have like a specific zine collection in the entirety of Newcomb Archives. And that's the Crystal Kyle papers. And Crystal Kyle is a scholar who wrote a dissertation on Riot Grrrl, so her collection is pretty much her research on Riot Grrrl, and she has tons and tons of just zines from the early 90s to early 2000s. And I was really excited when I processed this collection because some of the zines in there are zines that I had or had seen. And then also it's nice to see like a Babes in Toyland vinyl or, Bikini Kill vinyl in there. So that's one collection. And then the other one is this giant collection that we have out in our reading room for people who are in the reading room to look at if they want. And that's kind of a collection that has several different types of zines in it It does have like 90s zines like tossed in there, but it also has a good assortment. And, you know, there's like 90s zines, 90s fanzine, you know, individual like zines about people's individual lives, kind of like, you know, almost like a social media profile or blog. And then you see it go into like DIY, lots of zines about DIY, and then DIY zines, then zines being used as almost like artist books. So that's kind of what we have at Newcomb Archives, but we do also have a lot of different zines like mixed into and hidden in other collections, because it is a feminist collection and DIY feminism is something that is just part of feminist culture. But you find these types of participatory media where it's not just a product that somebody consumes, but it's a media where, you know, the audience can also participate, whether that's in the culture, whether it's making their own, or whether it's adding to it.
So that's an interesting transition into the question of what is maybe your personal definition of a zine, or how, as from a collecting standpoint, do you define a zine?
That's a really great question. I guess in my own words, a zine to me is just a way for somebody to express pretty much anything they want. We've got zines that are informational. We've got ones that are just based off of people's personal stories. We've got ones that are activism based, that are, I don't know, they can encompass such a wide variety of topics. So anything you want to get onto paper, you can make a zine about it. So
what I love about zines is that, you know, anybody can make them. You can put whatever you want in it. And, you know, there's just something about like using your imagination to kind of express yourself or get information out there, or to be inclusive, or to create safe spaces if maybe you don't have them.
So do y'all feel that the zine making, because we're talking about like sort of a feminist pedagogy and where zines can fit in academia, do you find that zines are kind of inherently a feminist pedagogy, or is there a reason why you think feminist makers gravitate towards the zine format?
You know, DIY feminism, you know, and participatory media is like kind of part of the culture. But, you know, when you get into like academia and like academic research papers and, you know, impact factors and peer review, sometimes that can be very scary. You know, what I like about zines and using zines in research and classes is that it gives students a way to learn the material and have fun with it and be creative about it and think about it as if, you know, you're distributing it amongst your peers. So it kind of takes the edge off as far as like formality of the traditional research paper. So it's a really great format to kind of think outside of the box, think outside of that formal research structure. They're also really fun to collect, you know. Nobody's really collecting copies of like a research paper and going, oh, this is cute, you know. But a zine, if you put it in a zine and you, of course, put cats on it, it automatically becomes a thing that is highly prized. Not trying to commodify zines or anything, but, you know, zines are special in the way that they're very individually made.
And the creation of them, too, can be like as cooperative or as individual as you want. You can make one alone in your bedroom, or you can make one as a part of a class at school with 30 other people. You can work together on one. You can do it solo. So. Yeah.
But when we teach, when we use zines for teaching research strategy, we usually, you know, whether they like it or not, it comes with, you know, what is a primary source and how do we find them. And then, you know, we usually have like a crafting area where, you know, we're like, we can either make, this is your time, you know, you either need to make a zine, which is part of your assignment, or sometimes it just be like, well, you know, it's always easy to have students do a collaborative zine where everybody just makes one page. So we teach them that, and then we also kind of we show them examples of zines from our collection and how it's not just, doesn't have to be so artsy. Like there are zines that are just text and a couple of little things on it. But also, I like to teach the zine as a life hack for any time, just like making a zine for any time you need to like make a book or make something to carry information or to communicate.
Students who are coming here to study zines, what is it that they are exploring through the zine collection?
Through the zine collection, we have, I think, maybe 3 types of students who come here for that. And it's like feminist, like gender and sexuality studies. We have a ton of zines on gender and sexuality, but also like feminist culture. Mm-hmm. So they're coming to look at that. And then also, like I said, professors looking for outside of the box ways to kind of have their students engage with creating research and sharing research. Like there was one, it was a neuroscience class, and the professor was trying to get the students to make a zine and learn about like distributing or sharing like public health information to communities. So that's one thing, but it's usually feminist classes about gender and sexuality and feminist culture, and then using the zine as like a template for kind of zining your research,
as it were. Yeah, I think it's so fascinating, especially when talking about feminist pedagogy specifically. I love the idea of making a collective zine where everyone is just making one page of the zine, because I think when we talk about like Riot Grrrl, especially the idea of zine collectives, I think I don't know if Riot Grrrl was sort of intentionally doing it, or if it's something that has been sort of historically imposed on them after the fact by zine historians. But the idea that Riot Grrrl was, by being a anonymous collective, was really challenging the like patriarchal individualism of the punk movement. I'm also very fascinated by this idea of DIY feminism outside of just zines. So what do you find in this like broader expanse of DIY feminism in terms of like community building and collectivism and feminist ideals in crafting and making and distributing things?
Well, I think if you were like a teenager in the 90s, one of your crafting circles or quilting circles was collaging. Because if we had access to the internet, it was not really that awesome. And there weren't a lot of like digital ready-made things that you could use, but there was lots of like magazines and flyers, and in a way the culture for that was almost like it's why I love memes today. Because if you look at it, making collages and just like kind of expressing yourself through that, it has kind of a meme-ness to it. But that, in my opinion, that was kind of my experience with like a crafting circle with my girlfriends. And since we knew about zines, which was very obscure in like South Georgia and Mississippi, it seemed like only teenagers who listened to certain music knew about certain zines.
Right.
But then, when I thought about it, all of the scenes around the area, even if they weren't like Riot Grrrly, probably had fanzines or zines or little, like I said, participatory media and things that they passed around that kind of informed people of, I guess, bands, mostly bands if it wasn't like a feminist thing. It was like music scene. But then, when I process and look at second wave feminist collections, you'll find like these kind of zine type things that are, talking about potlucks or events or, newsletters, these feminist newsletters. So, the zine in like a craft circle or like a culture is just it's just a DIY feminist like thing that's in there. If you had a band, you might have a zine, you might have made stickers, and then you might have like a really lo-fi cassette tape that you recorded with your band on it. And all of those things might just be part of your your culture, your environment at the time.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting seeing kind of how creativity in a group has changed over the years. I grew up in like the 2000s, 2010s, and our like creativity was like me getting together with my friends and like stealing my mom's video camera and like coming up with like funny skits or something that we never post to the internet. But I remember my first introduction to a zine was when one of my favorite bands was like selling one as merch on their website way back in 2009, 2010. But I remember thinking like, what is this? And like looking through like the pictures of it online and thinking, I was like, okay, I don't know why they're selling this, but that was like my first exposure to it.
Yeah.
One thing I really loved about zines when I was a teenager was that the ads in it were also just everybody else's zines. Mm-hmm. And, you know, like lo-fi bands and, you know, just things that you didn't see like in a store or whatever. Mm-hmm. So it was almost like this like secret, well, it's an underground culture.
So where do y'all see zines today and zines in an archive today? Is there more that they can teach us still today?
I think there's more that they can teach us. Like, for one thing, you know, even for archivists and librarians, zines have really taught me about like privacy and, you know, what it means to only kind of describe what somebody lets you describe, you know, and that's just because I'm a weird archivist. But, you know, I think there's more to be learned from them. And then in the future, you know, it's just kind of an awesome way to create something and not have to worry about like this kind of eliteness that comes with branding.
Personal opinion, but I feel like they might start to make a comeback in more like mainstream-ish popularity. Just because I feel like there's something to be said about this sort of physical underground media in our age of like surveillance, media censorship. So I think they're a great way to kind of get information out that is uncensored, like raw, very radical stuff. So
right. We talk about this as sort of the radical analog, that like something being physical now is it kind of inherently radical, like distributing things purposefully, like going out of your way to distribute things physically outside of big tech companies, outside of social media is or can be inherently radical even today.
I really feel like just the nature and the, you know, what is attractive about the zine is that if you commodify it, it kind of loses, it's almost like AI art.
Right.
Like, you know, when you commodify it and you make it mass produced, it has that feeling and it's dead.
Well, it comes back to this question of what makes a zine different from any other type of media.
I feel like zines just have this humanity to them that like mass-produced media just can't have, because somebody took the time to put all the effort into it and create it and get everything they want to get across into it and to hand distribute it. There's just, I don't know, there's so much personality to them that just can't be captured by like a newsletter that you print 500 copies of and then send off in the mail.
You know, in our collection, a lot of our third wave feminist materials are paper and more creative. And so the zine is also a way to like have something that's like tangible. You know, as we do more communication and research and our outputs on computers and online, like we don't have this paper trail that we used to have. And, you know, I kind of miss the paper trail.
I miss physical photos.
Yeah. And so when people make something, you know, out of paper like that, or, you know, it's kind of special. And I think that that is, you know, as zines become more popular again, because I think they will, then that'll be like, you know, kind of these materials, this paper material that we'll have. So, and I think students who use or, you know, make zines when they're in classes are very surprised that they made something. Like for some reason, the format of the zine means you made something. Like,
and they're really good too. We've had some students make like really great like mini zines.
We're talking about zines as being something that is sort of deeply personal, but I think on a more macro scale, an archival collection is also kind of a deeply personal way of studying history. Like you get a snapshot of a particular period of time, but through the lens of one person's, the papers that they collected, the letters that they wrote, the zines that they collected and formed.
Yeah, seeing history like through somebody else's handwriting
Yes.
is a lot different than reading about it in a secondary source.
You know, going back to why we categorize zines under DIY feminism. Because, you know, do-it-yourself is kind of, you know, well, it's not kind of. It is like, you know, being like, no, I don't want to buy mainstream.
Right.
I want to make it myself. And, you know, it's kind of defying capitalism.
Right.
You know, and so when you're, you know, when you're a teenager and you're in, you know, with your friends, you're looking at magazines, you're looking at media. And, you know, really the zine, when you discover zines, it's a way to kind of deconstruct what the magazine is. And if you look at magazines and its relationship to women, you know, deconstructing the magazine and poking fun at all of these stereotypes and tropes, you know, becomes kind of a fun way that you can connect with your friends or address issues that you may not know how to address because it's not, you know, kind of, you know, it creates safe spaces.
Right.
Crafting in circles and DIY things, you know, kind of are a byproduct or evidence of, you know, a safe space that was created.
Right. And I think that comes back to the earlier question of, are zines kind of inherently a teenage girl thing? Which is this idea of like things that would not be seen as important in an adult world. And I think that's especially true of things that are important to teenage girls. That like having a space where teenage girls can talk unironically about how important their fanfic is with their friends in these safe spaces that they have created for themselves is coming back to this idea of like a modern sewing circle, of creating a community, creating a safe space around a shared interest that is also that is creating something new that can then be shared outside of the circle to bring people into the circle. Yeah, I don't know.
Something that the former head of archives, Chloe Robb, and me started doing when Roe versus Wade was overturned. And we felt like, you know, having a collage or a crafternoon was a good way for everybody to kind of, in a low-tech way, come together and just comment, talk, you know, in a safe space and collage, make whatever. And so we did that, and then we kind of built off of that and started doing DIY feminism workshops. So it's usually DIY feminism in special collections and archives, and it's inspiring, synthesizing individual and communal learning experiences. So one thing when we're teaching Crafternoon and the zine and DIY feminism, we're also trying to explain like the safe space and then also kind of relate that to our archives, our feminist archives, as a safe space and a community space where, you know, you can research materials with no bias and without it being kind of framed for you, if that makes sense. And that's why I think, you know, there's more to learn from zines in the future.
Yes. Zines make the academic world a little bit more accessible. They're a lot more approachable than a banker's box full of 40 pounds of just manuscripts and logs and records and things like that. So that's why I like when the classes come in, because you get to kind of be like, hey, check out what an archives can really do.
Yeah.
And it kind of gets them more accepting of using primary sources.
I think that brings us full circle back to the question of like, where do zines fit in academia and particularly in an archive?
You know, when I'm teaching about like primary sources and using our archival material, you know, depending on what their class is, I select things in the archives that might be of interest to that particular culture or history. And, you know, when we use zines is a really fun thing to kind of get the attention of undergrad students, you know? and they almost have like the same kind of allure that comic books do. You know, and like I said, it's not that traditional research format, paper format. So it kind of, is a point of rest in this chaotic, like, academia competitive thing. One important thing about working with students and the archives is teaching them how to use the tools to look into the archives to find the thing. So, it's also kind of teaching them how to do the scavenger hunt.
Right. Yeah, because I think, again, people who have never done archival research before might not realize that an archive is not a library, that you can't just walk in and browse the shelves and pull things off and look at them. So can you tell us a little bit about how, briefly, how an archive works? Like how this idea of like the scavenger hunt of archival research.
Yeah, so a lot of the time archives aren't going to be categorized, inventoried, logged down to the item level. It simply takes too much time. And the archival backlog is this overlooming monster that every archivist has to deal with. But a lot of the times you're going to have archivists that don't know exactly precisely what is in their collection. In every single box, there's absolutely no way to know. And that's kind of where the scavenger hunt comes in. We have little like guideposts that we can give you. We have collections and we have boxes labeled with kind of vague outlines of what could be in there, but you'll have to put in the work to try to find the information that we can help guide you, but you're gonna have to dig through some boxes. But it's always those little gem moments when people find exactly what they're looking for. They open a book and some piece of paper that they were using as a bookmark falls out and it's got exactly what they need written on it. Things like that. I don't know, it's really fun to see that. And as an archivist, it's one of those moments that I really look forward to, is just helping that person find exactly what they need. But yeah, we're definitely not like libraries in that way. And I feel like a lot of people get that.
But also, the zine as, a tool to help explain to someone how to use a finding aid.
Yeah.
Like this is our zine collection, as simple as that, and this is this zine and here it is in our inventory. Because, while, the finding aid is just a giant inventory, it still can be very scary to someone who has absolutely no idea what it's for, what it's used for. So at very base level, like, finding fun objects in our collection that help students kind of make that click connection that, oh my gosh, like I can use this entire thing to say the things I want. And then, when we're doing just like a regular instructional where, we usually bring out an assortment of things to show students that kind of go, like here are the access points to our collection. And there are 2 books that we usually use that are like, hey, look at the index, see all these keywords, you're probably going to find this in our inventory. And so that's one access point. And then, we start with like kind of old items from like the history of Newcomb archives. And then we go all the way to zines, because, that's the only tangible thing right now that we have for third wave feminism. Like, I'm not bringing out the laptop and going, like, look at her research paper.
Right.
You know what I mean? So zines are, like, a more tangible kind of object that can help students, like, see this timeline, this time machine of the archives, and what kind of things they might find in it.
Yeah. And I think that, I keep saying this, but what I really mean this time, that comes back to the idea of zines in academia, which is that these things as collections can really only exist in an archive.
And, archival collections are all individually unique. They're almost like universes or planets where, like, everything had to be just right for materials to, like, collection development policy around this to happen.
And every collection has its own story to tell. It has its own unique perspective on the time it was created in. It has its own unique context. So every collection has worth.
Newcomb Archives, it was created through a national publications grant by Susan Tucker and Beth Willinger. And its original purpose was to preserve the legacy materials of Newcomb College. And from that, they built a giant, women's resource. And, in a way that's really amazing, because that means that Newcomb Archives is a contemporary collection that was created by second wave feminists. So it's not, a historical collection. There are things from the Victorian era, but it was put together by women.
Right.
Memory keepers.
And in a way says just as much about the people that put the archive together as the people that made the original collections and then donated, right? Is there a workshop coming up or an instructions coming up?
As an archivist who recently got out of school, if there's an archive at your university, please go check it out. Yeah. There are always lots of very helpful resources in archives, even if they don't have materials that you're looking for. Most of the time, the archivist will know where to point you to get the information that you want. I've seen too many students that come into our archive, use our materials, and we're like, wow, I had no idea this was even here.
Yes.
So
and it can be difficult sometimes to use an archive if it's on a university that you're not affiliated with at the time. So while you are a student and you have ready access to that archive, email an archivist.
Yep, absolutely.
That's the call to action.
Yeah.
Go onto your library's website. Find the archivist's email.
Yeah, also come and be student workers.
Beautiful. Thank you all for joining me.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening.
You.
I love talking about zines. I love talking about Kirk Spock fanfiction, and I love talking about women. That's it.
Do not lock knowledge in chains. Do not take our rights away. To connect, communicate. No slow lanes. Do not kill our innovation. Do not let money decide our access to information. No slow lanes. No.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
That's pretty, that's
very
pretty
versatile.
true. $1 million question.
That is the $1 million question.
Kids these days.
Kids these days.
They don't learn cursive anymore.
They don't learn.
It's weird. It's so weird.